Hi, this is Alexander Scott, a member of LANS, presenting this edition of our weekly updates. Before we continue, a reminder to please visit our website at jalans.org to view more party material, or follow us on social media. Our Twitter handle is @lans_JA. First, we will begin with the news of JPS requesting a rate hike. In a report by the Jamaica Observer titled JPS Seeks Rate Hike, it is reported that the power company is seeking a rate adjustment which would see an increase in electricity costs of 3.8% for household users and 2.2% for small businesses. The adjustments requested would also see large commercial and industrial customers faced with an increase of between 3 and 4% respectively, and very large businesses facing an increase of 4.3%. Now, in its submission, JPS noted that the request has taken into account, and I quote, cost pressures from uncontrollable factors such as foreign exchange movements, and that in order to mitigate the impact of these on the revenue and to reduce the costs that influence pricing to customers, the JPS continues to modernize the grid by investing in smart devices on the network, upgrades and expansion of the transmission and distribution network. End quote. Now, the request for a rate hike by the JPS at this moment in particular, as the country, like the rest of the world, continues to struggle with the COVID pandemic, is just another cruel cut and is yet another reason on show as to why we need to radically rethink how we approach electricity production and consumption. JPS as a company has made profits in Jamaica while under its current ownership, and it, along with a few select companies, have in fact done rather well during this pandemic. So the call for a rate hike cannot be justified on the grounds of needs. Consumers of all sorts have been hurting for some time, with households in particular constantly facing increasing and skyrocketing bills even while usage remains static, and they even had to resort to taking the company to court for its practices. We even see where the private sector, private industry, openly blasts and laments JPS and its prices, laying a large portion of the blame for the nation's lack of manufacturing at the feet of JPS, noting that the electricity costs are so prohibitively high that it makes manufacturing almost impossible. We are in this position because JPS has and continues to maintain a monopoly position granted to it by the state, and we remain in this position because the state has made it difficult, if not impossible, for a competitor to enter the market. We need to rid ourselves of this issue. The JPS monopoly must be broken, and the government which created it must be asked, and if needs be, forced by the people into breaking it up. We must introduce other competitors, local competitors, which use alternative and green energy. We must promote solar power and wind power, especially for residential consumers of electricity, in a meaningful way, and remove all these useless barriers that are currently in place, which stymie any attempt to open up the market and free it from this current monopoly situation that it's currently in. Next, we move on to the COVID-19 pandemic and our continued vaccine rollouts. In an article from the Jamaica Gleaner titled COVAX Trims Forecasts Supply COVID-19 Vaccine, Gavi, the Alliance, a group which manages the UN COVID vaccine shipment program, stated that it's expecting to deliver less supplies of the COVID-19 vaccine this year than was expected, and this is largely due to a key Indian manufacturer now focusing its attentions and therefore its vaccines on India as the country experiences a serious surge in COVID-19 cases. This means that instead of the expected 2 billion doses to be delivered this year, we are now expecting 1.9 billion doses to be delivered globally. including 1.2 billion doses for 92 of the world's poorest countries. In another article, this time from RJR, titled Jamaica to Receive US COVID 19 Vaccines Through Two Pathways, the US announced a new plan through which it will donate some 55 million additional doses of their COVID vaccines. It was further reported in the article that Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa are to be included in this program, and that 75% of the doses will be sent to those regions of the world through the COVAX facility. Now, the news regarding Gavi is pretty upsetting, as any slowdown on global vaccination and the shipment of these vaccines will eventually see a recurrence of this virus, and in a more virulent form, as we're currently seeing with the new strains. Every effort must be made to increase production, as well as the production capabilities within countries, and we can't help but feel that this need to trim doses, uh, it, it's going to cost lives, and it could have been avoided if there was a general patent waiver, even a temporary one, as well as the setting up of manufacturing facilities in other countries, specifically in the global south, which have been particularly affected not only by the pandemic but the lack of vaccines. The donation by the US, while appreciated, let's be real, something's better than nothing. It only goes to show how little is being done, again, by the US and the rest of the global north, and the little effort that is being put in to stem this pandemic. Because, as was noted in the article, Latin America and the Caribbean, we're only set to receive 14 million doses from this grand, noble gesture by the United States, even though we alone as a region have almost 500 million citizens. We're facing a serious problem. We've gained few vaccines through the current avenues, and coupled with the persons in critical age cohorts not taking the vaccine, and persons in critical work sectors not taking the vaccine, as well as blitz centers turning people back because they've run out of doses, we're going to have a problem. At this rate, any hope that the government has of reaching herd immunity by March next year is not going to be achieved. And in this vein, we urge the government to look elsewhere in order to get these vaccines. Cuba has at least 3 homemade vaccines, one of which has a 92% efficacy rate, as was reported just the other day. Russia has at least 3 vaccines currently in use. China also has, again, at least 3 vaccines currently in use. As we seek to get out of this pandemic, reopen our economy, but more importantly, save the lives of the Jamaican citizen, it is imperative that the government look to these countries to get vaccines and not rely solely on a facility which has proven to not be up to the task and currently sees the majority of the world remain exposed to this virus, while a minority, the usual minority, sits on a vast reserve of vaccines which could cover their citizens 3, 4, 5 times over. Something has to stop, something has to change, and to do that, we need to look elsewhere. We need to look to other countries in the global south who have made these strides, who have produced these things, and get them from them. Finally, we end with foreign affairs. On June 23rd, the United Nations General Assembly gathered to vote on a resolution calling for an end to the illegal US blockade of Cuba. This resolution, which has been placed before the General Assembly and voted on for some 30 years, was once again overwhelmingly accepted, this time seeing 184 members of the United Nations voting for the resolution, 3 abstaining, and only two no votes, the no votes being the United States and Israel. Elsewhere, between the dates of June 21st and June 24th, Venezuela hosted the Bicentennial Congress of the Peoples of the World, a gathering of left-wing and progressive movements and political parties from across the world. During this Congress, various forums were held to discuss how best these movements can enact change in their countries, create coalitions and international movements, so as to confront and defeat imperialism, as well as to share techniques and methods and express solidarity with one another. The vote at the United Nations must be commended. Once again, the majority of the world's nations have taken a stand and said that such actions of aggression are illegal, abhorrent, and simply must stop. It is pleasing to see that the issue of ending the blockade remains in the mind of the world. The blockade, lest we forget, has robbed Cuba of billions of dollars and starved it of infrastructural development, as companies which would be willing to build infrastructure are fearful of entering Cuba, lest they fall prey to the United States' secondary sanctions. It is important that we condemn and fight against imperialism, and the blockade against Cuba is simply one example of the tools of imperialism which must be resisted. To this end, we at Lands fully endorse the United Nations resolution condemning the illegal blockade of Cuba. We demand that the United States lift this blockade. And we congratulate the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for the successful hosting of this Congress, an event which at its core is anti-imperialist and progressive. The hosting of the Congress shows that in spite of US aggression, Venezuela still stands tall. Its revolution remains intact, and the country still has the support of the majority of the world, as well as left-wing and progressive individuals. With Western imperial countries sanctioning millions of people in the world, especially during this global pandemic, we see Cuba aiming to vaccinate people. While the West continues to try and keep people in ignorance and separate us, Venezuela, we see, is trying to bring us together and educate us and show us how to build a better future. We see where our allies are. We also see which system is built on oppression and which is built towards liberation. Long live the Cuban Revolution, and long live the Bolivarian Revolution. Once again, this is Alexander Scott, and you've been listening to Land's Weekly Update.